The pen scratched across the bottom of the deed of sale, and Clara Voss set it down before her hand could tremble. The ring sat on the clerk's counter between them, a thin gold band with a small garnet set in the center, the stone the color of dried roses, the metal worn smooth on one side where her mother had rubbed it every morning of her married life. The clerk, Mr. Fenwick, picked it up without ceremony, dropped it into a tin box with the sound of something small and final, and slid $2.30 across the counter toward her. She did not look at the money. She looked at the tin box. "Anything else, Mrs. Voss?" Fenwick asked, already looking past her. "No," she said. "That will do." She took the coins and tucked them into the inside pocket of her coat, where she could feel the small weight of them against her ribs. $2.30. Enough flour for 3 weeks if she was careful, enough salt pork to stretch 4 suppers to 7. She pushed the door of Fenwick's general merchandise open and stepped onto the wide plank sidewalk of Harlan, Kansas, and did not allow herself to think about the ring again. The sky above the main street was the color of old pewter. October had come to the plains like a man with a debt to collect, without announcement, without mercy, with the specific cold that meant the first hard frost was not far behind. Clara pulled her coat tighter and began walking north toward the wagon she had left tied at the water trough where her son Thomas was waiting with his sister pressed against his side for warmth. Thomas was 9. Eliza was 6. They were the only 2 reasons she had entered Fenwick's store at all. Thomas stood up straighter when he saw her coming. He had her husband's eyes, gray and serious, and her own habit of keeping his face still when things were difficult. Eliza had fallen asleep against the wagon wheel with her head on her brother's knee, and Clara lifted her daughter without waking her and settled her onto the wagon bench, tucking the thin wool blanket around both of them. "Did it work?" Thomas asked. "We have what we need," she said. He did not ask about the ring. He was 9, but he was not a foolish 9. He had understood the weight of what she had carried to town that morning. She was grateful he said nothing more, because she was not certain she had the composure to discuss it. She climbed to the bench and took the reins, and turned the wagon north out of Harlan, back toward the 12-acre homestead that was no longer legally hers, had not been legally hers since August, when the bank in Wichita had completed the foreclosure proceedings her husband Edgar had set in motion 2 years before his death by simply borrowing against everything they owned without telling her. The homestead was gone. The house she had kept for 7 years, the kitchen garden she had built from nothing, the well she and Edgar had dug together in the second spring of their marriage, all of it transferred, on paper, to a man she had never spoken to, a man named Cade Merritt. She had 1 week to vacate the property. That was what the letter from the bank had said. 1 week, Mrs. Voss. Please make arrangements accordingly. She had spent 3 of those 7 days making inquiries. A woman in her position had limited options, and she had cataloged them without sentiment. She could take the children to her sister in Dodge City, but her sister's husband had made his feelings about charity relations abundantly clear. She could apply for a domestic position at one of the large ranches north of Harlan, but most of those positions required a single woman without children. She could sell what remained of her household goods and take the train east toward nothing she could name. Or she could do what Reverend Aldous had suggested on Sunday, before she had been entirely willing to hear it. "Merritt's been running that ranch without a housekeeper for 2 years, the Reverend had told her in the quiet after the congregation emptied. "He's not an easy man, but he is, I believe, a fair one. He has no wife. He has land. You have no land. You have children who need a roof before winter sets in hard." "You're suggesting I ask the man who foreclosed on my home to hire me to clean it," Clara had said. "I'm suggesting you ask him for a working arrangement before pride costs your children a winter without shelter." She had thought about it for 3 days. She had sold her mother's ring, and now she was driving north toward Merritt land with $2.30 and a conversation she did not know how to begin. Then the ranch appeared on the horizon as the wagon crested the low hill that marked the edge of what had been her property line. She saw it first as a collection of shapes against the pale sky: a large barn, a main house, 2 outbuildings, a windmill turning slowly in the flat wind. As she drew closer, the details resolved. The barn was in better repair than the house. The fence line running along the western pasture was new. The kitchen garden behind the main house was overgrown and finished for the season. The dead stalks of whatever had been planted there bent and rattling in the wind. A man was standing at the fence beside the barn. He was watching her come. He did not move as she brought the wagon to a stop at the edge of the yard. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a dark canvas work coat that had seen several hard seasons. His hat was pulled low. His face was angular and unreadable in the way of men who have practiced being unreadable until it became habit. He had a coiled rope in one hand, which he did not set down. Clara set the wagon brake. She did not wait for him to come to her. She climbed down, lifted Eliza to the ground, and nodded to Thomas to follow. Then she walked the 10 yards of hard-packed dirt between herself and Cade Merritt and stopped at a reasonable distance and said, "Mr. Merritt, my name is Clara Voss. I believe you know my former property." His eyes moved to the children, beat then back to her. They were dark, those eyes, patient in the way that was not kindness but endurance. "I know the name on the deed," he said. "Then you know my situation." "I know the bank's account of it." She held his gaze. "I'm looking for a working arrangement. I'm experienced in household management, livestock care, basic accounting, and preserving. I can maintain your kitchen, your records, and your garden through winter in exchange for room, board, and a wage to be negotiated. I have 2 children who will not cause you difficulty. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for work." Something moved behind his eyes. Not softness, something more cautious than that. "You just described half the things this ranch needs," he said. "Yes," she said, "I'm aware of that." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the yard and lifted a curl of dust between them. The windmill turned. "The wage is $4 a month," he said. "Sundays are your own afternoon. You and the children take the back room. You stay out of my way, and I'll stay out of yours." "Agreed," she said. He turned and walked back into the barn without another word. Clara let out the breath she had been holding since Harlan and turned to find Thomas watching her with that careful gray gaze. "Is this our home now?" Eliza asked, looking at the house. "For the winter," Clara said. "Come, let's see what needs doing." What needed doing was considerable. The kitchen had not seen a woman's management in years. The floor was gritty with tracked-in dust. The iron stove had a cracked fire brick that reduced its efficiency by half. The larder was stocked with the barest necessities and nothing more. Clara stood in the center of the kitchen and turned slowly, and assessed it the way she had learned to assess every space she had ever been required to make habitable. Not with dismay, but with method. She found a broom. She put Eliza to work sweeping while Thomas carried their 2 trunks in from the wagon. By the time Merritt came in from the barn at dusk, she had the stove burning cleanly, a pot of salt pork and beans on for supper, the floor swept, and a cloth over the table that she had found folded in a trunk in the back room. He stopped at the kitchen door and looked at it all for a moment without expression. She set a bowl on the table. "Supper is ready," she said. He sat. He ate without comment. So did she. So did the children. The lamp cast a circle of yellow light over the table, and outside the kitchen window the plains dark settled in, vast and indifferent, and that was the first evening of their arrangement. She did not think about the ring. She told herself she would not think about it. She was largely successful, except for the moment before she slept, when she pressed her hand flat against the quilt and felt the absence of it on her finger. 3 days passed. Clara learned the shape of the ranch the way she learned everything, systematically, without asking for more than she needed to. She rose before Merritt, had coffee on and the stove hot by the time he came through the kitchen on his way to the barn. She did not attempt conversation. He did not offer it. They moved around each other in the kitchen and the yard with the careful precision of 2 people who have agreed to share a space and mean to keep their word about it. On the 4th morning she found the ranch's ledger on the kitchen table. She did not know whether he had left it there intentionally or whether it was simply where he kept it, but she opened it while she waited for the coffee to boil and understood within 3 pages why the ranch was struggling. The books were not badly kept. They were kept with reasonable care and no particular skill, which was its own kind of problem. There were expenses that could be renegotiated. There were patterns in the cattle sales figures that suggested Merritt was selling at the wrong time of the season and buying feed when prices were high rather than early. There was a payment listed to a man named Arliss Cole that appeared quarterly and was labeled only as settlement with no further notation. She closed the ledger and set it back where she had found it, and did not mention it. She mentioned it on the 5th day, when he came in from the east pasture in the late afternoon with the particular silence that meant something had gone wrong. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window and said nothing. She waited until the silence had a shape. "The ledger was on the table," she said. "I looked at it." He turned. His expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it. "That's my business," he said. "It is," she said. "But the feed supplier in Harlan will renegotiate the autumn price if you contract for full winter delivery before the end of October. You're 2 weeks from the deadline. You'd save $18. He stared at her. "Also," she said, "whoever Arliss Cole is, he's been collecting a quarterly payment from this ranch for 4 years with no documentation of what the settlement covers. That's either a debt that needs a proper accounting or an obligation that can be challenged." The silence in the kitchen was different from the silences that had come before it. He set his cup down on the counter very carefully. "How do you know about feed contracts?" he said. "My husband bought and sold cattle for 11 years, she said. "I kept the books for 9 of them. He looked at her, not through her the way he'd been doing, at her. "The coal payment," he said finally. "It's land use, old boundary dispute. His lawyer says we owe it. Our arrangement is verbal." "A verbal agreement for a land boundary dispute is worth the air it was spoken into," she said. "Do you have the original survey?" "Somewhere." "I'd like to see it," she said, "if you're willing." He crossed the kitchen and opened the door to the small room off the main hall that served as an office, and returned a moment later with a rolled paper that he set on the table. She smoothed it flat with both hands and studied it in the lamplight. The boundary line was clear. The survey was dated 1871. Whatever Arliss Cole's claim was, it was not supported by the document she was looking at. "This is your land," she said. "All of it. His claim has no basis in the survey." Merritt stood across the table from her and looked at the paper for a long time. "You're certain?" he said. "I am not a lawyer," she said, "but I can read a survey. You'd need a lawyer to formalize it. But yes, I'm certain." He rolled the paper back up without speaking. He took it back to the office. When he returned to the kitchen, he poured a second cup of coffee, which she had not seen him do before, and sat down at the table instead of standing. "The feed contract," he said. "What would you need from me to handle the negotiation?" She felt something ease in her chest, not warmth, something more practical than warmth, the particular relief of being given a useful task. "A letter of authorization and the account figures from the last 2 years, she said. He nodded once. "All right," he said. He almost said something else. She could see it in the set of his jaw, something forming and then released. Whatever it was, he kept it. He finished his coffee and went back outside, and Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard toward the barn and thought, with some surprise, that the arrangement was going to work. That evening was the first time she saw him with the children. She had sent Thomas to the barn to return a bridle that had been left on the porch post, and when she looked out the window 20 minutes later, Thomas was still there. She could see the lamplight from the open barn door and 2 figures inside, one tall, one small. And after a moment she understood that Merritt was showing her son something about the way a saddle was fitted. He was not performing patience, he was simply doing the task, and Thomas happened to be watching, and neither of them seemed to mind. She did not go to the barn. She put Eliza to bed and came back to the kitchen and sat with the feed supplier's last invoice and made her calculations. When Thomas came in, he smelled of horse and straw and wore the particular expression of a boy who has been shown something he considers important. "Mr. Merritt has 7 horses, he said. 2 are quarter horses and one of them is lame in the left foreleg. Did he tell you that?" "He showed me," Thomas said. "He said it's the tendon." Clara looked at her son's face and felt the specific ache of knowing that he had needed for months to be shown things by a man, and that tonight he had been, and that she could not afford to feel anything complicated about the man who had provided it. "Wash your hands," she said, "then to bed." That night, Mott lying in the back room with Eliza's small warm weight against her side, Clara stared at the ceiling and thought about Edgar, which she tried not to do more than once a week because it was neither productive nor comforting. She thought about the man Edgar had been before the debt, Easy laughing, generous, not careful with money, but careful with her, which she had mistaken for security. She thought about what it cost a person to trust the wrong things. Then she stopped thinking about Edgar and thought instead about the survey document and the feed contract and the 4 years of quarterly payments to Arliss Cole, and fell asleep with the numbers still moving in her mind. A week into their arrangement, Clara drove to Harlan for the feed negotiation. She had Merritt's letter of authorization in her coat pocket and 2 years of purchase records in the satchel on the bench beside her. She had also, before she left, reviewed the Mercantile's standard pricing structure, which was posted on a board inside Fenwick's store, and identified 3 competitors within 30 miles whose rates were lower. She did not intend to use the competitors, she intended to know about them. The feed supplier, a heavy-set man named Grist, who operated from a warehouse on the south end of Main Street, received her in the small office attached to the warehouse and looked at the letter of authorization with the expression of a man who is not certain what to make of a woman conducting business on behalf of a rancher. "Mr. Merritt's usually in himself," he said. "Mr. Merritt has sent me in his place," she said. "I have his authorization and his account records. Shall we proceed?" Grist looked at the letter again. Then he sat down, and she sat down, and they proceeded. She left 25 minutes later with a winter feed contract at $14 less than the previous year's rate, delivery to begin the first week of November. Grist had not been generous about it. She had been thorough. There was a difference. She was walking back toward the wagon when she heard her name. Mrs. Voss. She turned. A woman she recognized as Mrs. Hale, the wife of the town alderman, a woman with a talent for precision in conversation that served the same function as cruelty, was standing outside the dressmaker's with 2 other women of similar inclination. "I heard you've taken a position at the Merritt Ranch," Mrs. Hale said. The word position was placed with the specific care of a woman who wanted it, heard a particular way. "I have a working arrangement with Mr. Merritt, yes," Clara said. "A widow with 2 small children," Mrs. Hale said with a glance at her companions, "living alone in a bachelor's house." "Living in a household where I am employed," Clara said, "as a housekeeper and ranch manager." "Of course," Mrs. Hale said in the tone of a woman who means the opposite. Clara looked at her without expression and said, "Good day, Mrs. Hale," and continued walking to her wagon. Her hands were steady, her face was composed, the coins in her pocket were real, the feed contract in her satchel was real. Mrs. Hale's opinion was not, and Clara had learned, in the years since Edgar's death, to assign value accordingly. She did not know that Cade Merritt had come into town on an errand of his own that morning, had tied his horse 3 buildings down, and had heard the exchange. She found out that evening. He came into the kitchen while she was writing up the feed contract summary, the numbers, the delivery dates, or the savings in the ranch ledger, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "You handled yourself well today," he said. She looked up. His face was the same controlled landscape it always was, but there was something in it she hadn't seen before. Not exactly approval, something quieter than approval. "I did what needed doing," she said. "Grist doesn't give ground easily." "He does when the numbers don't support his position," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mrs. Hale talks loud for a woman who minds other people's business." She held his gaze. "She's not the only one who thinks what she says." "No," he said, "she isn't." He paused. "Doesn't make her right." He went to pour his coffee and she went back to the ledger, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the room was different after that, in a way she could not have measured and did not try to. 2 weeks into the arrangement, the first real cold came. It arrived overnight, the temperature dropping 40 degrees between dusk and dawn, and Clara woke to frost on the inside of the window glass and Eliza coughing in the dark. She had seen this kind of cough before, the croup edge kind, the kind that could go sharp in a cold night, and she was out of bed and at the stove before her eyes had fully adjusted. She had prepared for this. She had asked Merritt 3 days earlier if she could use a corner of the barn storage for a medicine kit, and he had said yes without asking why. And she had arranged what she had: dried thyme, a tin of camphor salve, clean cloth, a small bottle of spirits for fever. She had the steam going and Eliza's breathing easier within the hour. She was sitting on the floor of the kitchen with Eliza on her lap, both of them wrapped in the quilt, when she heard the floorboard creak in the hall and looked up to find Merritt standing in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, fully dressed, holding a lantern. "Heard the cough," he said. "She's improving," Clara said. "The steam is helping. I have it managed." He looked at Eliza, whose breathing had steadied to a rough but even rhythm, and then at Clara, who was sitting on a cold floor with a child in her arms with the specific competence of a woman who has done this before and knows what she is doing. He did not say anything. He went to the wood box and built up the fire in the stove without being asked, until the kitchen was warm enough that the frost on the window began to soften at the edges. Then he set the lantern on the table and sat in the chair nearest the stove and stayed. He did not explain why he stayed. He simply stayed. Clara looked at him once across the kitchen in the orange light of the stove and looked away. She was not prepared to examine what it meant that a man who owed her nothing had gotten out of his bed in the cold to sit with her through a sick child's night. So she did not examine it. "Thank you," she said quietly, because even if she could not examine it, she could acknowledge it. "You got what was needed before I knew it was needed," he said. "The medicine kit." "I try to prepare for what's likely," she said. "I noticed," he said. They sat in the warm kitchen while the plane's wind moved against the walls of the house, and Eliza's breathing evened into sleep, and that was the first night neither of them was merely surviving the arrangement, but had, without either of them quite meaning to, begun to depend on it. By the third week, the ranch had a different quality to its days. Merritt had not changed. He was still the man of short sentences and guarded eyes, still the man who issued requirements rather than requests, and moved through his own house as if feeling entitled to it might cost him something. But there were differences, small and accumulating. He had repaired the cracked fire brick in the kitchen stove without comment, leaving the kitchen one morning in better working order than she had found it. He had brought in an extra cord of wood and stacked it against the east wall of the house without being asked. Once, coming in from the barn, he had picked up Eliza, who had fallen asleep in the yard near the fence post, and carried her inside and set her on the kitchen bench with the care of a man who has handled small animals and knows something about not waking what is sleeping. Clara had watched him set Eliza down. He had not known she was watching. That was how she knew it was real. She had been thinking about Arliss Cole. The quarterly payment was due in 11 days. She had spent the better part of 2 evenings reviewing the survey document, the ranch's payment history, and the single letter from Cole's attorney that she had found in the office, a letter that cited a verbal agreement between Cole and Merritt's father, dating back to 1879, with no supporting documentation of any kind. She had also, through careful inquiry at the county registrar's office during her last trip to Harlan, confirmed that no formal easement or boundary agreement had ever been filed in Cole's name against the Merritt property. She brought it to Merritt on a Wednesday evening, laying the papers on the table in front of him in the order she wanted him to read them. "Cole has no legal claim," she said. "The verbal agreement, even if it existed, was made with your father and was never recorded. A verbal land agreement is unenforceable without witnesses, and the statute of limitations in Kansas for unrecorded verbal land contracts is 3 years. The payment is 4 years old." Merritt looked at the papers. He read them the way she had learned he read things, slowly, without rushing, making certain of what he was seeing before he responded. "Cole's a large man," he said finally, "and he's got 2 hands working for him who share his temperament." "I'm not suggesting a physical confrontation," she said. "I'm suggesting a letter from the county registrar confirming that no easement exists, delivered to Cole's attorney along with notice that the payments will cease. Let them challenge it in court if they believe they have a case." He looked up at her. "You wrote the letter," he said. She had. It was at the bottom of the stack. She had spent an hour on the phrasing, making it plain and correct and final. He read it. His jaw moved once, which she had come to understand was the equivalent of a significant reaction. "You weren't asked to do this," he said. "No," she said. "I did it because it needed doing, and I knew how." A long silence. The lamp on the table flickered once in a draft from the window. "I'll have it delivered Friday," he said. She nodded and began gathering the papers, and he put his hand on them, not to stop her, but because he was still reading the letter, reading it a second time with the slow attention of a man who is memorizing something. His hand was close to hers on the table. She was aware of it. She moved her hand away at an ordinary pace and stacked the papers and tied them with the cord and said good night and went to the back room. She lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and told herself with some firmness that she was an employee and he was her employer, and the arrangement was working precisely because both of them understood that clearly. She was not entirely certain she believed it. That was the problem. It is, at this moment, with Clara lying in the dark and something unnamed coiling tighter between two people who are both too careful to name it, that the story asks you to stay. Because what happens in the next room and in the next week and on the road to Harlan when the danger arrives is not something that can be put down. What will Arliss Cole do when that letter reaches him? And what will Merritt do when the cost of keeping Clara safe exceeds the cost of admitting why he wants to? On the Friday, the letter was delivered. Cade Merritt came home from Harlan 2 hours later than expected with a split knuckle on his right hand and said nothing about it at supper. Clara looked at the knuckle. She looked at his face. She set a clean cloth and the camphor salve on the table beside his coffee cup without comment and went back to the stove. He looked at the cloth. After a moment, he wrapped it around his hand. Cole wasn't pleased, she said. No, he said. Did he receive the letter from the registrar? He received it. And? Merritt turned his cup in his unwrapped hand. He said the arrangement was with the Merritt land, not with any particular Merritt. Said he'd be making certain I understood that. Clara was quiet. She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. He threatened you. He made his position clear. That is a threat. He met her eyes for a moment. It is, he said. She thought about this while she served supper. She thought about it while the children ate and Merritt ate and the lamp burned down an inch. She thought about the survey document and the attorney's letter and what a man like Cole would consider making certain someone understood something. She thought about Thomas, who was becoming comfortable here. She thought about Eliza, who had started calling the barn cat by a name. She thought about whether she had made this worse by being useful. I'm sorry, she said when the children had gone to the back room. He looked at her across the table. For what? He said. If my involvement with the Cole matter has accelerated the trouble. The trouble was there before you looked at the ledger, he said. You gave it a shape I could do something about. That's different from causing it. She held his gaze. He did not look away. You weren't failing, she said quietly. You were drowning. There's a difference. Something shifted in his face, not softness, but its precondition. The thing that must happen before softness is possible in a man who has not allowed it in a long time. He looked down at the table. He looked at his wrapped hand. The ranch hands know Cole's men, he said. Harlan is a small town. If he means to make trouble, we'll hear it before it arrives. And if we don't? He looked up again. Then we deal with it when it comes. The we was not planned. She heard it. She was not certain he had. He was, by the slight pause that followed, aware that he had said it. Neither of them addressed it, but it remained in the kitchen long after supper was cleared. Cole's first action came 8 days later. Not the man himself, but his method, which was a county magistrate's summons delivered to the ranch by a deputy sheriff who had the apologetic manner of a man asked to do something he considers beneath him. The summons claimed that Merritt had damaged Cole's fence line in an altercation outside Harlan and owed $60 in damages plus the cost of the fence. Merritt read the summons in the yard. His face was the flat, careful landscape Clara had learned to read as tightly controlled fury. She took the summons from him and read it herself. Did you damage his fence? She asked. I was on the road. Cole's fence is 50 yards from the road. So the claim is fabricated. Entirely. She folded the summons precisely along its original crease. Do you know anyone who saw you on that road? Jed Wheeler was driving the opposite direction, he said. Jed Wheeler was the neighboring rancher, a slow-speaking, methodical man of 60 who had, on the occasion of their one meeting in Harlan, looked at Clara and then at Merritt and then back at Clara with the expression of a man drawing a conclusion. I need to speak with Mr. Wheeler, she said. Merritt looked at her. He was trying to read whether she was doing this from obligation or from something else. She could see the question in him. I'll drive you, he said. The ride to Wheeler's ranch took 40 minutes on the north road. They sat on the wagon bench with the proper distance between them and the October cold, making their breath visible in the air. And they did not speak for the first 20 minutes. The plains spread around them in every direction, flat and enormous and indifferent, the dry grass pale as straw under a sky the color of iron. "Wheeler's a fair man," Merritt said when the Wheeler fence line came into sight. "I gathered that," she said. "He'll tell you the same thing I told you." "I know," she said, "but his version is the one the magistrate needs to hear." A pause. "You've done this before. Helped someone respond to a false claim?" "Once. My husband's brother attempted to contest Edgar's will on grounds of diminished capacity. He had no evidence because Edgar had no diminished capacity." "But evidence in your favor has to be assembled and presented. It does not assemble itself." He was quiet for a moment. "What happened to the brother?" "He lost," she said, comprehensively. Almost a smile. Almost. She did not look at him directly, so she caught it only at the edge of her vision, the slight release at the corner of his mouth, the fractional ease in the set of his jaw. It was gone in a moment, but she had seen it. They pulled into Wheeler's yard, and Merritt climbed down first and then turned and offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. It was automatic, the courtesy of a man who had been raised with certain habits, and she took it without thinking, and for the 3 seconds her hand was in his. She was acutely aware of the roughness of his palm and the steadiness of his grip, and then she was on the ground, and he had released her, and they were walking toward Wheeler's porch. Wheeler received them with the unhurried hospitality of a man with no reason to rush. He confirmed what Merritt had said about the road and the fence without embellishment. He had been driving his supply wagon north. Merritt had been going south. They had exchanged a word about the coming cold. Cole's fence was where it had always been, undamaged, 50 yards from the road. "Happy to say so to the magistrate," Wheeler said. "Cole's been pulling that fence nonsense since your father's time, Cade. Somebody ought to have put a stop to it years back." He looked at Clara when he said it. Not at Merritt. At Clara. "It's being addressed," she said. Wheeler nodded with the particular approval of a man who has waited some time to see something set right. "You've got a good one here," he said to Merritt, in the conversational tone of a man stating a fact about the weather. Merritt said nothing. He put his hat back on and turned toward the wagon. Clara said, "Thank you, Mr. Wheeler," and followed. On the drive back, Merritt did not speak for a long time. The sun had moved lower, and the light across the plains was the pale amber of late afternoon, and the dry grass moved in long waves like something breathing. "I should have addressed the coal matter 2 years ago," he said. "Yes," she said. He glanced at her. She kept her eyes on the road. "You didn't soften that," he said. "You didn't ask me to." Another pause. A long one. "My father took the arrangement to keep peace," he said. "He thought Cole would let it go if he wasn't pushed. He didn't." "Men who take something rarely let it go without being made to," she said. He considered this. "You've had some experience with that." "Some," she said. "Your husband's debts." She did not answer immediately. The question was not cruel, but it was direct, and she was not in the habit of discussing Edgar with anyone. She looked at the road ahead, the pale dust, the horizon. "Edgar was not a dishonest man," she said at last. "He was a man who believed that the next season would solve the last season's problems. That is a particular kind of faith that works until it doesn't." "And when it didn't?" "He was gone," she said quietly, "and I was left with the ledger." He said nothing, but he did not look away from her, and she felt the weight of his attention the way you feel the warmth of a fire before you have looked to find it. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She turned and looked at him. His face was forward, watching the road, but his jaw was set in the way that meant something was working through him that he had not yet decided what to do with. "You don't have to stay past winter," he said, "if you find a better situation." She understood what the sentence cost him. She understood that it was not what he had started to say. "I haven't found a better situation," she said. "I'll tell you when I do." He nodded. "Once." They drove the rest of the way home in the pale amber of the fading afternoon. Close enough on the bench that she could feel the warmth of his arm through her coat sleeve, and neither of them moved away from it. Arliss Cole came to the ranch on a Thursday. He did not knock. He rode in with 2 men flanking him and stopped in the center of the yard at the hour when Merritt was in the south pasture, and Clara was alone in the kitchen with Eliza. Cole was a large man, broad through the chest with a red face and the posture of someone who has not been told no in a long time. He dismounted without looking at the horses and walked to the kitchen door and opened it without knocking. Clara turned from the stove. "Mr. Cole," she said. He looked at her with the specific contempt reserved for people he had decided did not matter. "Where's Merritt?" he said. "Not here," she said. "If you'd like to leave a message." "I'd like to leave more than a message," he said. He stepped into the kitchen. "You're the widow woman, the one putting ideas into Merritt's head about documents and registrars." Eliza was at the far end of the kitchen table, very still, watching with wide eyes. Clara did not look at her daughter. She kept her eyes on Cole. "I'm Mr. Merritt's housekeeper," she said. "You're welcome to wait for him on the porch." "I'm not standing on any porch," Cole said. He moved another step into the kitchen, and the kitchen was not large, and the distance between them had decreased to something uncomfortable. "Tell Merritt the magistrate's summons is only the beginning. I've got a lawyer in Wichita who knows how to make things difficult for ranches that are already struggling." "A lawyer in Wichita," she said. "Not a local man." "Better connections," he said. "Or unwilling to sign his name to documents locally where they can be checked," she said. Cole's face went a darker shade of red. "Watch your... You came into this kitchen without invitation," she said in the same level voice. "And you're speaking in front of a child. You'll say what you've come to say plainly, or you'll leave. Those are your choices." He stared at her. He was not a man accustomed to this particular kind of opposition, not loud, not frightened, not moving. "The summons can become a full civil suit," he said, "land and asset seizure. Merritt can't afford that fight." "He can afford it better than you think," she said. "I've seen the accounts." "You're a housekeeper," he said. "You don't know?" "I know that the Cole land holding has decreased by 2 parcels in the last 3 years," she said. "I know the Wichita Bank has a second mortgage on your north section. I know that a civil suit costs both parties, and a man whose position is weaker than he appears cannot sustain one." She had learned all of this in Harlan, quietly, over 2 weeks of conversation with the right people. She had not known she would need it until she needed it. "I also know that perjury in a fabricated property damage claim carries a $400 fine in Kansas. You'd need to weigh that against whatever this is worth to you." The kitchen was entirely silent except for the soft sound of Eliza's breathing and the tick of the stove. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he had expected to find at this ranch, a frightened woman, a manageable obstacle, he had not found it, and the recalibration was visible in his face. "This isn't finished," he said. "I didn't expect it was," she said. He left. Clara did not move until she heard the horses leaving the yard. Then she sat down in the kitchen chair and put her hands flat on the table and breathed. "Mama," Eliza said. "I'm all right," Clara said. "Come here." Eliza came and pressed herself against her mother's side, and Clara put her arm around her daughter and held on. When Merritt came in from the south pasture an hour later, she told him what had happened. She told it plainly, without omission, and he listened without interrupting. When she finished, the expression on his face was something she had not seen before. Not anger at her, but a fierce and specific fury at himself, at his own absence, at the fact that Cole had stood in his kitchen and she had been required to face it alone. "You should have sent Thomas for me," he said. "There wasn't time," she said, "and I had what I needed." "Clara," the way he said it, low and careful, the name doing work he wasn't ready for the words to do. "Cole isn't—" "I know what Cole is," she said. "I've known men like him. They push until pushing costs more than it returns. I made certain he understood the cost." He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at her across the room with an expression that had entirely abandoned its carefully maintained neutrality. What was beneath it was not comfortable. It was something older and more urgent. "You did it alone," he said. "I've been doing things alone for 3 years," she said, not with bitterness, as a fact. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him, and neither of them moved. He was close enough that she could see the dust of the south pasture on his coat, and the tight set of his jaw, and the thing in his eyes that he'd been holding back for weeks. Not anymore, he said. He did not touch her. He said the two words, and then he stepped back and set his hat on the counter and went to pour coffee. And Clara stood in the center of the kitchen and felt something in her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She was careful with it. She carried it the way you carry something fragile across a room, without looking at it directly, without trusting too much. She could not afford to be wrong again. The coal matter resolved itself with the precision Clara had predicted. The county magistrate, presented with Wheeler's sworn statement, the original survey document, and a careful accounting of the payment history alongside the registrar's confirmation of no recorded easement, dismissed the summons within a week. Cole's Wichita lawyer sent one letter in response, formal, correctly addressed, and completely without the authority its language attempted to project. Clara read it, identified its weakness in 3 points, drafted the response herself, and gave it to Merritt to review. He read it standing at the kitchen counter. He read it twice. "This is exactly right," he said. "I know," she said, not with pride, with the plain confidence of someone who has done the work carefully. He signed it. They sent it. As the lawyer did not respond again. The ranch hands had been watching all of this. 3 men, quiet and weather-hardened, who had worked the Merritt land long enough to have opinions about it. Clara was aware of them the way you are aware of any careful audience. She had felt their initial assessment when she arrived. The widow woman, the children, the uncertain arrangement. She had not attempted to charm or reassure them. She had simply done her work. By the 6th week, it was Hatch, the eldest of the 3, a man of approximately 50 with a gray mustache and the unhurried economy of motion that marked the genuinely competent, who had begun to greet her in the morning by name and who, on 2 occasions, had come to her rather than to Merritt with questions about supply ordering. Merritt had noticed. These she knew because she'd caught him watching Hatch speak to her once, with an expression that landed somewhere between satisfaction and something harder to name. The days had their own rhythm now. She woke early, coffee in the stove. The morning inventory she had begun keeping. Supplies, livestock numbers, weather observations, small accounting notes. Merritt through the kitchen on his way to the barn. The brief exchange, sometimes a sentence, sometimes only acknowledgement, that was the fulcrum on which the day turned. She had stopped cataloging it as professional. She did not know exactly when that had happened. The evening of the 7th week, there was a frost warning, and she and Merritt spent 2 hours in the kitchen garden bringing in the last of the root vegetables while the children helped carry, and the temperature dropped steadily and their breath made small clouds in the dark. Thomas had taken to helping with the root vegetables with a competence that surprised her. Eliza had taken to getting underfoot in the specific way of a 6-year-old who is content and knows she is permitted to be there. At some point during the 2nd hour, Merritt began handing her the turnips from the row he was working, and she stacked them in the bin without breaking her own rhythm, and they were working in the complete darkness now with only the lantern, and their hands were cold and dirty, and the frozen earth smelled of minerals and cold. And she was aware with the particular precision of the body that they had not once been out of arm's reach of each other for the better part of 2 hours. "That's the last of them," he said. She straightened. Her back ached pleasantly. The bin was full. The garden was cleared. Merritt picked up the lantern and she carried the bin, and they went inside, and he held the kitchen door open for her, and she passed through it close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm, and he did not move back, and she did not apologize. In the kitchen, Thomas and Eliza were both asleep at the table, Eliza with her head on her folded arms, and Thomas sitting upright with his chin on his chest. Merritt looked at them. Something moved across his face, quiet and unguarded, the face of a man who is feeling something he has no armor against. Then he lifted Thomas without waking him. Clara lifted Eliza. They carried the children to the back room and settled them and came back out into the hall and stood in the dim light from the kitchen lamp with no particular reason to remain there and neither of them moving to leave. "They worked hard tonight," he said quietly. "They always do," she said. "They're good children." "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The hall was narrow and warm from the stove and smelled of cold earth and wood smoke, and the specific combination of those 2 smells that had become, in 7 weeks, the smell of this house. He raised his hand. She saw it happen, the deliberate reach upward, toward her face, toward the loose curl that had come unpinned sometime in the garden and fallen against her cheek. His hand was close enough that she could feel the cold of it before it arrived. He lowered it. He stepped back. "Good night, Clara," he said, and went down the hall to his room, and she stood in the narrow hallway and pressed her hand to her cheek where his had almost been, and understood, with the certainty of a woman who has been careful for a long time, that they were past the place where caution was going to be sufficient. The snow came the second week of November. It arrived in the way of plain storms, sudden and absolute, the sky going white in the early morning and the wind shifting in the night, and Clara woke at 4 to the sound of it against the window with the particular knowledge that this was not a light snow. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen and stoked the stove and had the heat building before Merritt's boots were on the floor. He came through the kitchen with his coat half buttoned, and she handed him coffee without being asked, and he took it and drank it, standing at the window, watching the yard disappear into white. "The herd's in the south pasture," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll manage the house. What do you need before you go out?" He turned from the window. He looked at her, really looked at her. The way he'd been doing more often in the last 2 weeks, with the attention of a man who is memorizing something because he has begun to understand it might matter. "Nothing more than this," he said. He went out. She spent the morning managing the house against the cold, stuffing the window seams, keeping all 3 stoves lit, heating the flat irons to warm the children's beds, setting soup on for midday in case the hands came in early. Thomas helped without being asked. Eliza was useful in the particular way of a child who has learned that usefulness is what is wanted. Hatch came in at noon, half frozen, his mustache white with ice, and ate standing at the stove because he said sitting down would make it harder to go back out. He told her the herd was accounted for, the north fence was holding, and that Merritt had sent him in with a message. "He says the south fence broke," Hatch said. "2 sections. Wind took a post. He and Denny are working it now. He says not to expect him until the light fails and to keep the south stove going." "It's going," she said. "Eat something before you go back out." Hatch looked at her with the slow approval of a man who has been on the frontier long enough to know what kind of woman survives it. "You're good for this place," he said, "for what it's worth." She put a plate in front of him and said, "Eat," and he did. When Merritt came in at dusk, he was ice-covered and exhausted in the deep way of a man who has been working in brutal cold for 8 hours. She had the bathwater hot and a clean set of clothes on the chair in the hall and a meal holding on the stove, and she did not hover and she did not ask questions. She simply had what was needed where it was needed. And he moved through it with the practiced quiet of a man who is too tired to maintain his guard. He came to supper with color returning to his face, and his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and said, "The south fence will hold." "I knew it would," she said. He looked at her across the table. The children were eating. The lamp was low and warm. Outside, the snow was still falling, and the house was the warmest thing on the plains for 20 miles. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "I want to renegotiate the arrangement," he said. The table was very quiet. Thomas had gone still, the way he did when something important was happening that he understood imperfectly. Eliza was watching Merritt with the complete and guileless attention of a child who likes someone and sees no reason to hide it. She waited. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a housekeeper, as—" He stopped. He looked at his coffee cup. He was not a man practiced at this, and the lack of practice was visible and, she found, more affecting than any Polish would have been. "Permanently," he said. "As my wife, if you're willing. If that's not something you want, I understand it, but I'd rather say it plainly and be refused than not say it." She held his gaze across the table. She thought about the ring in Fenwick's tin box. She thought about what it had cost her to set it down. She thought about this man building up her fire in the night and lowering his hand in the hallway and saying her name like it was something he had earned the right to. "Yes," she said. Not with performance, not with the elaborate relief of a woman rescued, with the plain, considered certainty of a woman who has examined what is in front of her and knows its value. "Yes," she said again, simply, completely. And he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, rough-palmed and warm, and kept it there. Thomas very quietly went back to eating. Eliza smiled at her plate. Outside, the snow was still falling, covering the plains in white, and inside the kitchen of the Merritt Ranch, the lamp burned steadily, and the stove held its warmth. And Clara Voss felt, for the first time in 3 years, that the ground beneath her feet was something she had chosen and something that would hold. 2 days after the snow cleared, Merritt rode into Harlan on an errand he did not explain. He came back in the late afternoon and unsaddled his horse and came into the kitchen where Clara was working at the table with the accounts ledger, the winter figures neat and improving under her hand. He set something small on the table beside the ledger. She looked at it. It was her mother's ring. The thin gold band, the garnet set in the center the color of dried roses, the metal worn smooth on one side. She did not move for a moment. He sat across from her, and there was no theater in it, no speech. He had gone to Fenwick's store and bought the ring back and brought it home and put it on the table in front of her. That was the whole of it. "When did you—" she started. "The day after you arrived," he said. "Fenwick had it in the display case. I recognized the description from the estate records." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "You've had it for 6 weeks," she said. "I didn't know how to give it to you," he said. "I didn't want to give it back like it was charity. I wanted to give it back when it meant something different." She picked up the ring and turned it in her fingers. The garnet caught the lamplight and glowed for a moment, a small warmth in her palm. She thought about her mother's hands. She thought about what objects carry and what they are allowed to mean again when the right time comes. She put the ring on her finger. It fit the same. The worn side settled against her finger like a thing coming home. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head once, not dismissing the thanks, deflecting it, because he was not yet comfortable being thanked for things that cost him nothing in comparison to what they meant. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way he had reached for her 2 nights before. His hand turned under hers and held on. Outside the kitchen window, the plains spread to the horizon in the clean white of the settled snow, the sky above them a hard, clear blue, and the windmill turned in the afternoon wind with the slow, steady rhythm of something that has found its balance at last. The ranch was not saved, not entirely, not yet, but it was being saved by 2 people working side by side with the particular faith of those who have stopped waiting for the next season to solve the last season and have begun, instead, to build something that will last the winter and the one after that. And Clara Merritt, the name settling around her with the naturalness of a thing that was always going to be true, turned back to the ledger, and Cade Merritt turned back to his coffee, and the lamp burned warmly between them. And that was enough. That